Hey, Indian Creek 8th grade students, it's Professor Blazek, and I'm here with part 2 in our video series on the civil rights era, looking at early protests of the movement. Now, the guiding question that I would like you to keep in mind as you watch this video is, what impact did early civil rights protests have on America? So let's begin by looking at one of the early protests, the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Now, the Jim Crow laws that were in place during this time in Montgomery, Alabama, created separate sections in city buses for white and colored passengers. Now, on December 1st of 1955, an African-American seamstress and NAACP member named Rosa Parks would board a bus in Montgomery, and she would sit in the first row of the colored section of the bus. Now, when the bus began to fill, the driver told Parks and the other African Americans sitting in her row to give up their seats for white passengers. Parks would refuse to move, and at the next stop, she would be removed from the bus, arrested, and fined $10 for her refusal. Now, there was obviously a great amount of uproar over Rosa Parks' arrest, and following this event, African Americans in Montgomery would organize a boycott or a refusal to use the city's buses. An area Baptist minister named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would take the lead in the boycott, and this would begin his rise to national prominence as a civil rights leader. Some 50,000 pamphlets were circulated at African American churches around Montgomery to spread the word of the boycott, and African Americans all over the city began to walk, bike, or carpool around the city. Now, because such a high percentage of the bus company's riders were African American, the Montgomery Bus Company's profits would plummet, and in 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court would rule that bus segregation was unconstitutional. Now, as I mentioned, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a leader of the Montgomery bus boycott, and he had been inspired by the actions of A. Philip Randolph, an African-American labor leader, and Mohandas Gandhi to use nonviolent protests in the face of racism. King would preach the practice of civil disobedience or a refusal to obey unjust laws, the bus boycott being just the first of many such examples. Now, King would go on to help organize the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, in 1957. This group would focus on nonviolent protests, on showing civil rights workers how to protect themselves, and on identifying sites and ways to organize future protests. And the SCLC would play a major role throughout the entire civil rights movement. Now, let's look at some additional protests during the early part of the civil rights movement. Now, early protests would target segregation primarily in the South, but segregation still existed in the North as well, and would soon become a focus of the civil rights movement. High school and college students would go on to organize sit-ins, another form of nonviolent protest, in nearly 80 cities across the country. Now, a sit-in is a form of protest where those who were taking part would sit down in a store or business that practiced segregation. The most famous example of these protests occurred in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960, and the two pictures shown at the right are taken from those Greensboro sit-ins. Now, many of the stores that were the sites of these sit-ins would go on to desegregate in the face of the protests, and sit-ins would help launch the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, another important civil rights era group. Now, as we discussed earlier, the Supreme Court would rule the segregation of buses to be unconstitutional following the Montgomery bus boycott. Another civil rights group from this time period, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, sought to identify if the court's ruling was actually being followed. So, groups of both black and white CORE activists called Freedom Riders decided to board buses from Washington, D.C. that were bound for New Orleans in the summer of 1961. Now, when one of these buses reached the town of Anniston, Alabama, a mob had gathered and would actually follow the bus moving forward. Now, when the bus's tires blew out, a firebomb was thrown into one of the bus windows, and the Freedom Riders were beaten after they escaped the flames. Riders on a second bus were ambushed by a mob in Birmingham, Alabama, and also beaten. And so this caused the first two freedom rides to end after only 10 days. But the images of these early freedom rides would grip the nation and would spur further action. Now, a later freedom ride bound for Jackson, Mississippi, would see the riders get arrested and jailed by police and National Guardsmen. However, during the summer of 1961, over 1,000 Americans would take part in these freedom rides, and media coverage continued throughout and pushed the federal government to take additional action to ban segregation on interstate buses and within bus stations and terminals. And so we shall end this video with a return to our guiding question: what impact did early civil rights protests have on America? From the Montgomery Bus Boycott to sit-ins to freedom rides, there are a number of sources you can draw on for your answer. In the following video, we will look at some of the actions of the presidents in America during this time relating to civil rights. Until then, this has been Professor Blazek, and I will see you all next time.